Talk a bit about how porn impacts the brain and why that's just so attractive to people that can't seem to deal with their emotions.
It's such a great question. So this is a question that I was wondering, right? So we're seeing in our community, we're seeing just a huge uptick in pornography usage. And I was like, what is going on? Like, why is porn, like, what's going on? So I sat down and I did what I was trained to do, right? Which is any good academic doctor is trained to find answers in the literature. So I went to the scientific literature and I tried to understand, okay, which parts of the brain are affected by sex, right? So, and then this is the cool thing is like when we look at things like substances of abuse, something like alcohol. So alcohol will affect our GABA receptors. Opioids will affect our mu receptors, kappa receptors. THC will affect our anandamide receptors. There are very focal parts of the brain that are affected by substances. So I was trying to figure out, what does pornography affect? Where's the porn receptor? And that's where what I discovered is, if we really stop and think about it, sex and procreation is arguably the purpose of the human organism. And so every part of our brain is involved in sex. Literally every part of our brain, every neurotransmitter. If you look at sort of the neuroscience of sexual arousal, sexual engagement, bonding, all that stuff, every part of our brain is affected. So what we see in pornography, and if we kind of think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, like, there's a reason why people can be in like heart failure and still engage in sexual activity, like especially men. And like the gonads still produce sperm, you can still get somewhat of an erection and you can still get like some kind of ejaculation. So our body is willing to sacrifice so much to preserve the ability to procreate. So it is a very, very, very important evolutionary goal. And what pornography basically does is take advantage of this. So if we look at the effect of pornography, I think it's far more whole brain than something like marijuana or alcohol. And this is what we tend to see with all of the behavioral addictions. So these are not substances, but this also happens with things like video games, where there isn't a discrete part of the brain that lights up. We see a more diffuse activity all across the brain. And if we sort of think about it, right, the drive to procreate is so powerful that when you get aroused, you stop thinking about all kinds of other stuff. This is why when people fall in love, they make stupid decisions, right? Because all the other parts, all of your brain becomes aligned towards this one goal. You're thinking about it a lot. You're obsessing about this person. You're falling in love. We romanticize this. But there's a neuroscience component to that, which all gets activated by pornography. So pornography is one of these things that is just such a potent stimulus that is so easily accessible. And furthermore, it doesn't frequently come with the consequences that we're talking about. See, no one gets cancer from watching too much pornography. No one gets lung cancer. No one gets liver cirrhosis. No one goes through like, seizures when they're withdrawing from pornography. So it doesn't come with some of these consequences, and yet it activates, it really suppresses some of our negative emotional circuitry. It gives us spurts of dopamine when we orgasm. Even if you look at some of these ancient yogic texts, they say that orgasm is a state of temporary enlightenment. Because if you really pay attention to the state of mind in orgasm, you have no thoughts, right? It's a moment of pure bliss. So if you kind of think about people who get addicted to things like opioids or alcohol or marijuana, what are they trying to do? They're trying to get away from their thoughts. They're trying to get away from their mind. And the moment of orgasm is a very powerful physiological and neurological way to get out of all that stuff. So it's just a very potent kind of physiologic neuroscientific tool to help us feel better.
So then would you say there's a big misconception that people think that the majority of people who are watching and engaging in porn, or just that the majority of people who are watching and engaging in porn are just unhappy with their sex life, they're feeling lonely, they're not in a relationship, and in fact the reality is it's just giving them this massive cure to all the negative emotions in their life?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that's, I'd say yes and no. Okay. So you're absolutely right that I think it is solving more than loneliness for sure. But remember that see this is the problem with all these technological interventions that we have now: pornography, video games, whatever, social media. See, the reason that these things are growing is because they scratch an evolutionary itch. So our brain has a desire for relationships. We have all kinds of circuits in our brain that measure our social status compared to other people. They can induce anxiety. They can help us feel comfortable. This stuff is very deeply wired. The problem with technology is that it gives us a shadow, but it does give us something. It gives us a shadow of what the real world provides. So, I have relationships with people online that I would consider very real friends of mine. I emotionally bond with these people. And so I can get some very real value out of this thing. The problem is that it never gives us the complete real life version. So just if we look at friends, for example, I can talk to my friends online and we can work through a breakup together, right? So let's say I get dumped and they provide emotional support. That's very real. And if you look at, for example, the social networks of gamers during the pandemic, gamers were actually resilient against the early stages of depression and anxiety because we actually had a social support network that was virtual. So we were fine not leaving the house. The challenge, though, is if you look at that online relationship, I can't get everything. So when I hug another human being, I get a release of oxytocin. That makes me feel good. It makes me feel bonded. It alleviates some degree of stress. But you can't hug yourself, right? So there's something that's always missing. So this is the challenge with something like pornography. And this is becoming more of a problem, not just with pornography, but with some of these like social media aspects of pornography, like OnlyFans, because now we're seeing the development of parasocial relationships. So it's not just the direct neuroscientific effect of sexual activity. Now I can interact with this person. I can get their attention. I can pay extra money to have them call me out specifically. At the beginning of a video, they're going to say, hey, I made this for you. And that scratches more itches in the brain. So we're seeing that pornography is evolving. And I think as it scratches those itches, as I'm getting my needs met through the pornography, that will propagate my loneliness, because just like marijuana or anything else, I'm not actually fixing those problems in my life. So it creates this kind of dependency that keeps people stuck, because my brain is not, I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but see, if my brain gets none of its needs met, it will work really hard to get its needs met. Right? So if I'm absolutely starving and absolutely like thirsty, I will do whatever it takes. But if I have something that gives me some amount of water, then I will never be desperate enough to actually fix the situation, because I'm getting enough of it kind of handed to me in a very easy way. And that's what pornography does.
So I want to dive into like things like social media and even like Netflix, because what you just said about like giving it like this instant fix, right? And dealing with loneliness. I think social media can certainly do that too. Like personally, like I found that like if a post or a video does really well, like I get this massive dopamine rush. And then if one doesn't, I'm like, oh, like bummer, right? And I think that's common amongst people in the content creation space. And I also know people that when they are lonely, because of the fact you can just binge Netflix shows, you could sit there all day and check out and just watch like your favorite show over and over again for days on end. So how do you put stuff like that in the same category as porn in the way that it impacts the brain, or is it slightly different?
I would say it's different. So some things are similar and some things are the same, right? So it's not going to engage all the same circuits that pornography does. It'll activate different things. But we're starting to see, especially with things like OnlyFans, like we're seeing that blending, right? So there's a social media component that's combining with pornography. But as you mentioned, so social media activates all kinds of other circuitry. So there's this kind of, human beings are acutely aware of like what their status is in relation to other human beings. And this is what social media really like picks up on. So the challenge is that in the past, we had no way to quantify our social status. Like I didn't actually have like a social rating. But with the creation of things like social networks, we can literally quantify how much people like you, right? There's like a literal button called a like. And that is something that is very, very like addictive in a sense, right? Because now we know exactly what we need to do to get more likes. We have a quantification of something that used to be like hard to understand. How do I get more people to like me? What do I do? It's kind of confusing, but social media really taps into that.
So what do you think is the remedy or the solution for all of this? Because as somebody who's been in recovery for over 15 years, I know that substances and external things like we've been talking about provide this an immense amount of value to our lives, and they're highly addictive, and the feeling is highly addictive. And at the same time, the further down the addiction path we go, the more shame we develop and the lower our self-esteem becomes. So now you're at this horrible crossroads where you're highly addicted to something that makes you feel really good and you feel like crap about yourself and you have no confidence in your ability to change. So how does somebody handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So that's the problem. The problem with the addiction is that when you're done with using, you create a worse situation that requires you to use. So you have a bunch of shame. So you need some kind of substance to make the shame go away. We absolutely see that going on with technology. So I would say, and this is kind of where I take like a yogic perspective. And I think there's a reason why, if you look at like the evolution of psychotherapy and psychiatry, basically there's something going on right now called the third wave of psychotherapy. The third wave of psychotherapy is the incorporation of certain like Eastern concepts into clinical treatment. So we have these things like dialectical behavioral therapy, which includes a lot of mindfulness. We have things like acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a very good evidence-based treatment for addictions. And so we're starting to incorporate some of these Eastern concepts. And I think the most important thing is that if we look at what all of these things do, what they do is externalize our attention. We spend less time with ourselves and we spend more time with the outside world. And this is creating all kinds of other problems that we haven't even touched on. See, when I'm not in touch with myself, I don't know what I want.
Right.
Right. And if I don't know what I want, what I end up doing is looking to the external world, looking for successful people. And then I say, okay, well, this person is happy. This person is successful. That's what I should do. And then we start to do that, but we don't actually feel that internally. We have a question mark in here and we're looking for answers on the outside. And then once we start duplicating what that person is doing, then it doesn't work the same, because that person was passionate. That's why they got there. But I'm not passionate. I'm just mimicking what they're doing. So this is kind of what ends up happening is we're kind of directionless in life. We don't really know what we want. And then in that directionlessness, our brain is kind of like, why not get some dopamine today? Because I'm not working towards anything in particular. And if you look at there's some really interesting multivariate regression analyses on risk factors for pornography addiction. So what correlates with pornography addiction? And the number one thing that I've sort of found in the literature doesn't say necessarily that this is number one, but this is what I think is really important, and there's very strong correlation, is meaninglessness in life. And you know, I know you struggled with substances in the past. And if you really like look at every single person who's overcome an addiction, a big part of it is you have to have a really good reason to. You have to care more about fixing the addiction than what the addiction provides. And right now, we're such a purposeless society. It's like, what do I want to accomplish a year from now? Who the hell knows? Right? And then we go on like finding this answer from the outside, but we're not in touch with ourselves. And so I think the most important thing that needs to happen is we need to get back in touch with ourselves. Stop running away from our emotions, connect with what we want. Because when I work with people who are addicted to pornography, on any given day, it's just not worth it to avoid porn. It's not like they move towards something significant. The cost is not that high. I might as well watch a little bit of porn, maybe jerk off a little bit, maybe masturbate a little bit, and then I can go on to the empty life. You know, the life is empty before and the life is empty after. There's no cost, really. And so a big part of it, I think, is just re-internalizing our attention, connecting with ourselves, becoming like grounded. And this is something that I think is incredibly important because technology is only going to get more addictive. Like, it's not like one day some platform is going to wake up and say, oh, you know what? This is addictive enough. On the contrary, they're all competing for our attention. So what's happening right now is all the platforms are trying to pull users towards their platform and pull people away from other platforms, which is what they're designed to do. I mean, I don't think that's evil. It's just, you know, anytime you have a marketplace, everyone wants you to use their product. That's their goal. The problem is no matter which platform wins, you lose because you're losing the attention no matter what. So what we really need to do is reconnect with ourselves, spend a little bit more time with ourselves, learn to work through emotions as opposed to numb them, right? Try to figure out what we want instead of letting social media tell us the ways in which we're deficient and how we can spend $59.99 to fix that problem, right? This is exactly what's going on. And so what we really need to do is get connected with ourselves, because even social media will create things like body dysmorphia, right? There's a really disturbing trend that we're seeing where body dysmorphia used to be more common in women, and we're starting to see equality between men and women. And men have a lot more body dysmorphia than I think historically they've ever had. And so that's all because we're making our sense of self is being dictated by what we consume from the outside. It's not being developed from in here.
We've talked about how a lot of these substances and things can lead to being addicted to the other things that we've talked about, like porn can be intertwined, with like weed and video games and alcohol, and they all can be connected somehow. As far as the solution for this, I know you're talking about the importance of getting connected to ourselves and developing some purpose in life, which I know is incredibly important. There's also been a lot of talk about like dopamine detox. Do you think, given that these addictions can be related, do you think it's important for somebody to essentially just detox from everything and really focus on finding themselves? Or do you think that there can be a happy medium with like watching like some content like you and others that are genuinely helping people overcome addiction?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there are a couple of different, let's say, like neuroscience, psychiatric things going on, okay? So the first, let's talk about dopamine detox. So see, when we use any kind of substance or even activity, our brain will develop tolerance and we will need a higher signal. So if we look at something like pornography, what we tend to find is that over time, people will change the way that they watch pornography. Pornography consumption tends to get hardcore over time. So things will become more extreme. And that's because in order to get the same stimulus from the brain, so when we get some amount of stuff, and it's the same thing with like caffeine or alcohol, right? So at the beginning, like I'm a lightweight and 2 beers will get me drunk. And then like as I develop physiologic tolerance, I need 3, I need 4, I need 5. Same thing happens with video games. So if you pay attention to people who play video games, the first hour or two that you play is really, really fun. And then the subsequent hours that you play are less fun, but you can't seem to stop. So when we talk about dopamine detox, the way that I sort of think about it is resetting your sensitivity to dopamine by abstaining from certain dopaminergic activities for some amount of time. That can be very, very helpful. It's basically resetting your neurochemistry. But I'm a big fan of not abstinence when it comes to behavioral stuff. So when I work with people, so abstinence from things like marijuana, alcohol, opioids, caffeine, go for it, right? You don't need that stuff to survive. But when we look at things like behavioral addictions, things like sex addiction or social media addiction, unfortunately, we live in a world where these have become part of life. So I was talking to a second grade teacher, and they told me that 100% of the boys in their class play Fortnite. So if you're the one boy in the class who does not play Fortnite, you are denied a social experience with your peers. So it's here and here to stay. So this is where I think it's fine to detox for a while. And there are some places out there that will do this kind of like, these video game addiction like rehabs, where you have 30 days of sobriety and it's built on the sobriety model, which I think is fine. But then the problem is when these people are done, like they go back into the world, and like sobriety is hard, especially when it comes to technology. So our approach is to teach restraint instead of restriction. What I believe you should be able to do is develop an internal relationship with yourself and to get your psychological needs met in real life so that all this stuff becomes recreation. So I literally failed out of college because I was addicted to video games, and I still play video games and I teach my kids how to play video games, but there's a healthy way to do it. And the core problem with a lot of these things is that they start to become the primary source of the way that we get our needs met. So if my main method of managing my emotions is playing video games, then anytime there's negative emotion, I have to play video games, and that's going to create the cycle we talked about. So now, for example, I go for a walk every day. And if I go for a walk every day, I don't listen to anything, I don't talk to anyone, I just let my mind run wild. And it thinks through all the problems that I have, and over time I kind of calm down, and then I feel emotionally better, and then you can play video games, fine. And then I'll come home, I'll settle whatever I need to, then I have to play video games for a little bit, and then it's fine. So I think that we can detox to recalibrate, absolutely. But I think long term, we need a sustainable way to live our life that does not fall victim to technology. See, we should have enough resistance to it to where we don't need to avoid it. We can manage it.